Hello and welcome to Jesus Centered, a site that's dedicated to helping you see Jesus on every single page of the Bible. In that sense, it's a bit like Where's Wally, but with perhaps more eternal significance. I'm Christen Foster. Here you can see me on this luxury mouse mat. I'm going to be talking you through this series of videos. This one here will be the first of 8, which will give you an overview of the different kinds of ways in which you can see Jesus right the way through the Old Testament. I'm also responsible, of course, for the content on the site jesuscentered.org. So if you've not visited us before, please note that our web address uses the UK spelling for the word centered, and we're a .org rather than a .com. Now, it was way back when I was much younger that I first read A.M. Hodgkin's book, Christ in All the Scriptures. That inspired me to do my own research. I had to do a presentation for a training year I was on, so I decided I'd make this my subject. But when the presentation and the training year were over, I just kept on searching for Jesus in every single one of the books of the Bible, checking cross-references, collecting insights. Some books were easier to find Jesus in than others. Obadiah was a bit of a tricky one, but believe me, Jesus even makes it into Obadiah, short as it is. So while I started that, I first used to do it with a colour coding system. So prophecies would be one colour, typologies would be another, and so on. By using colours, I could highlight the different ways that I found Jesus in the Old Testament, and of course the ways in which the Old Testament story was leading me to him. But unfortunately, I didn't always have coloured pens with me when I found something. So in time, as I consolidated the different colours, I also developed a set of easy-to-draw icons, so that any time I did spot something that improved or reshaped my understanding of Jesus, I could note it down. And I've been doing that for about 30 years now. It was about 4 years ago, actually, that I first felt that Jesus told me to start deliberately passing on what I'd learned. I'd just been doing it for my own benefit before. So as a starter, here are my 6 colours and 7 icons. In the following videos, we're going to think about each one of those icons a little bit more thoroughly. But before I do that, I just want to share some thoughts on the whats and whys of taking time to see Jesus on every page of the Bible. See, when I say you see him on every page, I really do mean on every page. Let's just get a bit of a feel for some statistics before we go further. So this is my study Bible. It covers the entire Old Testament in just 1,200 or so pages. But the Old Testament also has over 2,000 occurrences of the name Jesus. Of course, it's the Hebrew word Yeshua, which we don't see because it's often translated as salvation or deliverance. But Jesus would have read his own name there in the promised plans of God over 2,000 times. And on nearly 3,000 occasions, we find God being referred to using a plural name or a plural noun, either Elohim or Adonai, which technically mean gods or masters, but they're used as if they're singular. They imply a trinity, which of course in turn implies Jesus. So that's 3,000 plural names of God, 2,000 occurrences of the name of Jesus, that's 5,000 in total, but that's peanuts compared to what we're going to look at next. You see, the most common word in the Hebrew Bible is a little word that appears over 9,000 times and yet doesn't appear in our English translations because it plays a grammatical role, so we just don't translate it. That little word is the word et or at. It's made up of the first and the last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. In that sense, it's the Hebrew equivalent of the idea of the Alpha and the Omega, a title that Jesus takes on and gives himself in the book of Revelation. But actually, to the Hebrew mind, that little word itself said a lot more, because, as we're going to see in the next video in this series, the letters that made up the word at not only meant first and last, but they also spoke about a big sacrifice. John understood this, which is why I think he starts his gospel with the words, in the beginning, which is like it starts in the beginning of the book of Genesis, in the beginning was the Word, because in the first sentence in the book of Genesis, we find this little word, at, in the middle of it. And as he looked at it, seeing this word that breathed right the way through from Genesis through to Malachi, the most common word over 9,000 times, he saw that that little word carried the idea of the sacrifice that Jesus was going to come and live in real life. It carried in symbol, as the written word, what Jesus was going to come and live as the living word, the first, the last, and the biggest sacrifice. So that's another 9,000 times. So where have we got to so far? 14,000 different things, and we've hardly scratched the surface. Included in the Old Testament, we find over 300 messianic prophecies. We're going to find hundreds of models that speak to us of Jesus. There are people who do things in ways that Jesus did. There are objects which somehow speak of this. Jesus says, I'm the bread come down from heaven, which is they're taking a model from the Old Testament. We find hundreds and hundreds of those, and there are lots more. So over this series of videos, we're just going to look in a little bit more detail about the kind of 7 different revelatory threads that run through the entire Old Testament. So back to my list. When we look at prophecy, we're going to see there are at least 3 different styles of prophecy. And most people understand kind of predictive prophecy, and most people feel, even if they don't always understand with their heads, what ecstatic prophecy is about. But often they don't even see the significance of formative prophecy at all. Now, I'm not going to explain to you right now what the difference is between them, but we'll get there when we look at them. And when it comes to typology, most people, of course, are aware of some of the major types that you find in the Old Testament. The Passover lamb models Jesus. The scapegoat models Jesus. The temple is a model of Jesus. But actually, the Old Testament is loaded with people, events, and things that all model Jesus in different ways. Then exploring the Old Testament actually expands our understanding of the things that Jesus taught. You see, most of Jesus' own teaching either draws from the imagery and the ideas found in the Old Testament, or it takes a verse that perhaps has been lost and he gives it kind of new prominence. It's like a phrase like, "the meek shall inherit the earth," which is a direct quote from Psalm 37. It becomes much more famous, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount. So sometimes when we find the source of an idea in the Old Testament, we actually discover that Jesus has either radically reinterpreted it, or we find that he was perhaps teaching something other than what we thought when we've only come to it using the experience of the modern world. So then we move down and we have a look as well at Jesus' household. We explore the ancestors, of course, whose stories are told right the way through the Old Testament, from Genesis to Malachi. See, which Malachi prophesies Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. Genesis prophesies Jesus right from the beginning. And as we walk through their stories, we're going to see that they accumulate promises and they accumulate blessings, and even they accumulate the occasional rebuke or curse, which sometimes gives God a bit of a problem and actually means he has to kind of create an extra little loop in history to solve a problem that he's created himself. Well, perhaps it's not so much God who created the problem, it was the person who was being rebellious at the time. Onan is someone that jumps to mind in that kind of context. Some of you will also be aware, of course, that actually if you take Jesus' ancestors, their names and stories actually start to create a prophecy that beautifully predicts the shape of the life that Jesus actually is going to come and live. And fifthly, we're going to look at things in the Old Testament that demonstrates God's plurality. We've already thought about his name or the divinity of the coming Messiah. And then sixth, we're going to take a look at how God appears visibly in the Old Testament, because, see, the New Testament tells us that no one's seen the Father, but it's the Son who has made God known. So, therefore, we understand that when we encounter one of these appearances of God, it's a Christophany, an appearance of the pre-incarnate Son of God, of the Jesus, of the Christ. And when we look at those carefully, we actually sometimes find there are characteristics that reflect and remind us very much of the Jesus we see in the Gospels. Finally, there at the bottom, I added a 7th icon. It's a magnifying glass. It indicates that there are times when you have to look a little bit below the surface meaning of a text. I didn't give it colour because what you'll find is, when you do, is that there's already a colour you need to add there. It's just that we can't see the prophecy or we can't see the model unless we look a little bit deeper. So you might find a hidden prophecy or a model of Jesus, or there might be an alternative translation to a verse that makes it more messianic than at first it seems. And it's this cryptic stream of revelation that we're going to explore first in the very next video in this introduction series. We're going to call it Jesus Hidden in the Hebrew. But before we do, I just want to quickly address the questions of why bother? After all, there's always going to be someone who knows more stuff than you do. After all, I've just told you that I've been doing this for 30 years and it still feels like I'm paddling around in the shallows of revelation. You don't need all of this stuff to be a Christian. Filling your head with fun facts and figures kind of puffs you up. It's not what our faith is about. Of course, that is true. Our faith is so much more than just information. Yet at the same time, it's also simpler than theology. Life in Christ is simple enough that when Paul had to leave Thessalonica, having just been there for about 3 weeks, he was able to write to the church he left behind, fully confident that between them, this little group of new believers knew enough that they could go on growing in Jesus as long as they needed to. Paul had given them enough to go on feeding themselves for the life journey ahead of them. And that's, of course, the key. There is a process through which our faith in Jesus becomes about life more than it does about doctrine. If we get it right, it keeps on sustaining us and keeping us fresh in every season of life. It's the process of Word and Spirit working together. Jesus taught that process. The Old Testament saw it, the Word and the Spirit, as both being active in creation. Just go and have a look at Psalm 33. And that's what Paul taught the churches that he planted too. So in 2 Corinthians, he writes, And we all, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord, who's Jesus, are being transformed into that same image from one degree of glory to another by the Spirit of the Lord. See, notice the Lord, who's Jesus, the Word made flesh, so this is the Word, and the Spirit here are active in transforming and changing us. And this whole process really starts with seeing Jesus and his glory. So as you go on working through these videos and the material that you'll find on the JesusCentered.org website, come at them and look for revelation of Jesus and his glory in them, because that then becomes seed that changes you rather than just a fact that you can kind of proudly pull out in a conversation. See, our future is here to explore and feel into the ascended Christ, who's just so vast. He sums up everything, he's in all, and everything's in him. He's far too big to get to know at that level. We get to know him through the incarnate Jesus. God contracted to a span, as the hymn so beautifully puts it. Jesus' life is kind of photographed by the Gospels, but then both the Old and the New Testaments expound them and unravel him and unwrap him so that we can get to know the unknowable God. When we find Jesus in an obscure passage in the Old Testament, well, the theologians call that Christocentric. And when one of those strange stories in the Old Testament leads us into a place of revelation of who Jesus is, well, the theologians call that Christotelic. Really what they mean is he is both the centre and he's the circumference of who we are. He is the fringe and the focus of our faith. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction overview. We're going to dig a little deeper in the next video, which, as I said, is going to be called Jesus Hidden in the Hebrew. But until then, it's goodbye and loving Jesus. And just to remind you, I'm Christen Foster, and this is Jesus Centered. Thank you.